Hello, my name is Brian McDonald. I'm a technical writer and editor, and this is Verbs, Not Nouns, writing documentation that users want to read. This is a conference talk that I've given at several different conferences now, and every time I do, I'm asked if there is a YouTube version of it. So this is that definitive version of this talk. For the next little while, I'm going to talk about different kinds of documentation, what they're for, and how to make them more readable if that's what your goal is. So, beginning at the beginning, there are lots of different kinds of documentation for lots of different purposes, but you can break them all down into basically two buckets: reference docs and tutorial docs. Now, tutorial docs are what I'm going to be mostly talking about here, but let me just go through what reference docs are for the sake of comparison. So, reference docs need to be comprehensive. You don't want a feature of your product that's not described by any docs anywhere. Reference docs focus on the product. They tell you what the product is, what its features are, what the various buttons do. And the user experience is designed for quick retrieval. Let me give you an example. So, reference docs that you've seen elsewhere include man pages, API references, code comments, etc. This screenshot here is from DigitalOcean's API documentation. You can see that it covers the schema, it covers the parameters that you could include, it's got samples, it's got the various responses, and it's even got ways for you to test out various API calls and see the results. And all of that's fantastic. This is API documentation that does what it's supposed to do. The one thing it isn't is readable. And that's fine for a reference. To give you a simpler example, the ultimate example of a reference is a dictionary. You want to know the definition of a word. The dictionary has a standard user experience. You look up the word, you find the definition, you go on with your day. Quick retrieval is the goal here, and it's not intended to be read front to back. Now, by contrast, tutorial documentation isn't comprehensive. You won't be focusing on everything that the user could possibly do with the product. You're going to focus on the things that they're most likely to want to do. Likewise, the focus is on the user rather than on the product. What is it that the user wants to do with your product? What's the thing they're trying to get done? And they're designed to be read from beginning to end. This doesn't mean that we assume that every reader will read the entire doc, but it's designed as if they will. So this is an example from DigitalOcean's tutorials. Specifically, it's the tutorial on how to install the Apache web server on Ubuntu 22 by my former colleagues Aaron Glass and Janelle Horcasitas. Note here that the step titles, which you can see two of them on the main screen and the rest of them in the menu bar on the left, all of these titles have verbs in them. They cover a task. These are things that the user wants to do. You have to install Apache. You have to adjust the firewall. You have to check your web server. At no point here are we discussing the features of Apache. At no point here are we discussing, say, the architecture of Apache. That information can still be conveyed, and I'll get to that later, but the tutorial as it's constructed is built around what the user wants to do. Now, why are we doing that? The user experience for a tutorial is to tell a story, and the user is the hero of that story. If you remember your Joseph Campbell hero's journey, the hero of the story starts at a place of ignorance. They have something they want or something they want to do, but they don't know how. Throughout the course of the story, they have successes and failures, they have ups and downs, and eventually they reach a point where they have achieved the thing that they set out to do, they've reached their goal, and they're possibly even a better person for it. The purpose of a tutorial is to smooth the user's path, to help them get from the state of ignorance to the state where they have accomplished something without as many pitfalls, without as many setbacks. That's what the tutorial is intended to do, and that's why it has the user arc that it does. So, references are nouns. They tell you what something is. So when you organize a tutorial around the nouns, you get something that looks like this. Now, this kind of documentation is in fact old, and it wasn't even created by Microsoft because Microsoft's better at that now. But this is third-party docs for Microsoft Word. And this is the pattern it falls into. We're describing words, so we'll tell you what's in the file menu, and we'll tell you each thing individually, new, open, close, etc. The problem here is that it treats every one of these options equally. Everything has equal weight. So the things that you do more often, such as, say, save or print, aren't prioritized here, and they have the same weight to them in this menu as print preview or page setup, which people don't use as often. Now, it's easy to criticize this sort of documentation when there's examples like this, but here's another example. So this is the architecture of a Kubernetes cluster, which is running on Azure with some extra bits and pieces involved. There's plenty of documentation that starts with a big diagram like this and then goes on to explain everything. And that's fine if you're specifically talking about the architecture. If I'm an experienced Kubernetes administrator and I'm trying to set up an architecture that looks like this, then yeah, this document would be useful for me. However, if I'm just trying to find out how to set up a Kubernetes cluster, and I've never done it before, this huge diagram isn't going to help me any. The failure here is that the author of this piece is asking readers to remember all of this until the point in the tutorial where it becomes relevant. And at the beginning of the tutorial, the user doesn't know which bits are relevant, so they don't know which bits they have to remember. So they have to remember the whole thing, which is cognitively difficult. Now, by contrast, if references are nouns, tutorials are verbs. They tell you how to do something. So going back to our installing Apache example, this is organized by verb. Each step in the tutorial is a specific task. It's something that the reader wants to do. And the step title provides them with that information. So let's talk a second about verbs. Not all verbs are created equal. Verbs that do well for tutorials are verbs where something happens. Specifically, there's a change of state. So verbs like configure or secure or automate, there's a clear change of state between what was the system like before you configured it, what was the system like after you configured it. You can see the change there. Less useful verbs that still tend to pop up a lot, understand, know, learn, these don't have a change of state in the real world. They create a change of state inside the user's mind, which is certainly good, but that's not necessarily actionable. The user wants to see that they're making progress. They want to be able to point it at the state of the system and say, I did that. That's a change. I made that change happen. And if they're in a step that starts with understanding, then they're not changing anything in the system. The understanding and the learning are secondary goals as far as the user's concerned. What they want is an installed Apache server. So understanding the Apache architecture isn't necessarily helpful to helping them reach that goal. But as I said before, you can still provide that information, and we'll see how that happens later. I do want to take a second and acknowledge the verb use. This one's kind of a catch-all. So I could say using Apache to serve web pages. Or I could take use out, find the stronger verb, and say serving web pages with Apache. With that said, there are some cases where the verb is not as obvious. If I say using Apache as a reverse proxy, okay, there isn't necessarily a better verb to go along with that. So use is the only thing that you can do. So be careful when you go to use the word use. So if you find yourself using the words understand or learn, note that you can just take them out of the sentence, and the sentence normally reads the same. You'll learn how to add a server to your cluster. If we take out learn how to, you'll add a server to your cluster. Note that we're emphasizing here the action that the reader is doing and not the fact that they'll learn how to do it. Because walking them through it once isn't necessarily a guarantee that they'll learn how to do it. They might only do it once a month, in which case they come back to this tutorial repeatedly every time they need to know how to do it. And that's fine. Eventually they'll learn how to do it on their own, but it won't necessarily be the first time. Let me take just a moment here as an aside for grammar pedantry before anyone roasts me in the comments. Gerunds are words that end in ing, and they're technically not verbs. They are considered nouns. That is the proper part of speech for a gerund. However, we will consider them sufficiently verb-like for the purposes of this discussion that gerunds and verbs, you can use them interchangeably. However, important caveat, make sure that whichever you choose to use, gerunds or verbs, you use the same form consistently. Don't mix and match within sections. Okay, so having outlined the different types of documentation and the reason that you want to use verbs in tutorials, it's trickier to create verb-based documentation than it is to create reference docs. So I'm going to start at a fairly high level and walk you through the process of using verbs, not nouns, in all levels of your documentation writing. Starting to create a new document, starting with a blank page, is a notoriously difficult task. Nobody likes to look at a blank page or a blank screen. And so to start to write, you think, okay, I have to write about this product. Let me write about the things in the product. I'll write about the things in the interface. And then right off the bat, you've started off with a noun and you're writing yourself a reference doc when you didn't want to. To write a tutorial-based doc based around verbs, it's best not to just start writing, but in fact to brainstorm and outline. And I apologize if that's giving you flashbacks to grade school English classes. That probably won't be the last time that happens, but I'm going to try and make this as painless as possible. I recommend outlining in two phases. So the first phase is the brainstorming phase. You're just making a list of tasks. What is it that you want your users to do? At this point, nothing is out of scope. Whatever you think of, write it down. Don't second guess yourself. Don't judge the tasks. Just start writing it down. What is it that you want your users to do? What was my intent when creating this product? If the product's already out in the world, ask the users, what do you use this product for? Because I can almost guarantee you that there is a user out there using your product in a way that you never intended it, and in fact, that might be a little bit scary. So if the users already exist in the world, ask them. And again, write everything down. If a user's doing it, then that's something that you might want to document. And we can't assume that they're doing it wrong. They might be doing it against your intent, but it's still working for them. That makes it a candidate for documentation. So like I said, write down everything. Don't make any judgment calls at this point. We're not throwing anything out. We're just adding to the list. And in point of fact, make sure that you're defining steps discretely. In other words, configuring Apache is a umbrella task that has many subtasks within it. So you might have to configure the firewall, you might have to set up new users, you might have to adjust various security levels. So all of those go within configuring. All of this can be on the list. You can write down the big thing, and once you've written down the big thing and you say, oh, that's actually a bunch of smaller things, then write down the smaller things too. Phase 1 of the outline process, just make a pile of tasks. Give yourself time to do this. It takes time. This is not something that you can sit down in 10 minutes and write down everything that you think a user might want to do with your product. However, over the course of time, thinking about it and using your product, putting yourself in the user's shoes, eventually you'll start to run out of things. So then you can move on to phase 2. Prioritizing the use cases. As I said earlier, tutorial documentation is not comprehensive. If you try to be comprehensive with tutorials, you'll just keep on writing forever. So break things up into smaller tasks, right? Take that list of tasks that you've got, apply the 80-20 rule. Say which of these things are the users most likely to do. Prioritize those. Check your existing documentation, see what you've already got, because you don't have to redocument something you already have. Then organize things by audience level. So look at your tasks and say, is this a beginner's task? Is this a task that everybody's going to need to do? Or is it an intermediate task that they'll do this some of the time, but not everybody will? Or maybe this is an advanced task for power users. Dividing the tasks that way does give you a priority, but it also helps you define your audience. So you can recognize the fact that if you're writing about an advanced task, fewer users are going to need that particular piece of documentation. But if you've already documented everything else, then yeah, the users may appreciate advanced tasks. This is something that you'll have to decide within your own document base. So just to recap, 2 phases of the outline: make a pile of tasks, then organize the pile. All right, so if you've got your outline organized, every task that you've decided to write about is one document. So from there, we're going to break the document down into steps. So when you're writing at the step level, start by looking for the verb. For the next couple of slides, let's just assume we're defining a browser. It doesn't matter which browser, it's just a browser, and the user is a time traveler who's never used a browser before. So if the document that we're aiming for is how to view a web page, we can divide this up into 2 steps. Say, enter the URL, press enter. That's not bad. Both of these start with a verb. It could be better, though. So make sure that the steps are complete and in the proper order. So if this is a time traveler, they haven't used a browser before, they probably didn't know that they have to start it. We also said type in the URL, but we didn't tell them where. So we'll tell them to start the browser, click in the address bar, then type in the URL, then press enter. Now we're pretty sure that we've got this. It's extremely common to skip steps. Even within this example, without putting ourselves in the audience's shoes, we'd forget to tell them to start the browser. The assumption that we made about our audience is they've never seen a browser before, so we have to tell them that. If we make a different audience assumption, that this is someone who's been using browsers for a while, we probably wouldn't need that step. So when I say steps should be complete, they should be complete for the audience that you've decided upon. Now, we can do better here than we had. We told the reader to type in a URL, except they had no idea what a URL is because they're a time traveler. This is where the background information comes in. I could have told the reader at the beginning of the tutorial what a URL is, how the browser communicates with servers. I could be explaining the server-client relationship. I could be explaining IP addresses. I could be explaining the OSI model, and I don't think anybody wants that. If I gave the reader all that background information at the beginning, I'm not telling them which pieces they need to retain for later. I'm just throwing a lot of background at them. Whereas, if I keep the structure that we had, I'm emphasizing the verb. Step 3 is type in the web address. Then I can add some information to that step. A web address is also called a URL, and then I define what a URL is. That's background information that the user doesn't necessarily need, but it will help their understanding. But I'm putting it at the point where it's relevant to the reader. We call this just-in-time learning. So in other words, we're taking the cognitive pressure off the reader by asking them to retain some fact until the point where it becomes relevant, by not presenting it until they reach that point. So enough with the browser example. Also consider keeping your steps short. This is going to become a theme throughout this talk. You want to have one task per step. Just as in the outline stage, we divided things into major tasks, within each tutorial, you want each subtask to be one step. There should be one state change per step. So looking at that Apache tutorial again, you can see how short this is. Step 1 fits on a slide, and then step 2 happens. That's good. We want signposts within the tutorials. We want the reader to have places where they can take a break. And in fact, you want more of them than you probably need. It's a cognitive rest stop for the reader, because we don't know the circumstances in which the reader will be reading this. They might get interrupted. They might be tired. They might not be at their best when they're reading. So we put in more rest stops than they need. Just as when you're driving on a highway, you probably don't need every rest stop that you pass. But depending on your circumstances, if you have small children with you or if you don't feel well, you might need more than you would on a different day. So we build in these stops. We keep the information short. That allows the reader to cognitively process smaller pieces, which aids with understanding. So in addition to just being short, we want signposts as well. Introductions, transitions, and conclusions. An introduction sets up the tutorial. So you don't want to be focusing on the background, the noun, what is the product, but rather focus on what's the reader going to do in this tutorial. Tell them specifically what they will accomplish. Then you take the steps to tell them how. Similarly, a conclusion doesn't just restate what they did. You emphasize the change of state. You say, here's the thing that changed, and here's what you can do with it now. Okay. But I want to more specifically point out transitions, because these are important to move from one step to another. I got a little tired of the Apache example, so I switched to an Nginx example. This one is by Alex Garnett. And look how we've set up the transition here. So there's a sentence before the step heading. Now that you have certbot installed, let's run it to get a certificate. So that tells you what was just accomplished. Certbot is installed, and it tells you what you're going to do next. You need to run it. Notice that we're talking about verbs here: installed and run. So the next step title is confirming the configuration. Now, it won't be immediately clear to the reader what that has to do with getting a certificate. So the very next sentence tells them exactly why. You need to be able to find the correct server block in your configuration to configure SSL. Okay. And then from there, you'll go on to get the certificate. So before the heading, first part of the transition tells you what you accomplished, tells you what's coming next. Then you have the heading, which you can use to find this spot again if you need to. And then after the heading, you find out what this step has to do with the last one and what you're going to do with the next step. This is the evolution of the old phrase, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Done wrong, that results in saying the same thing 3 times. But what you're doing here instead is you're setting up the reader for success, you're providing the signpost, and then you're guiding them through the next step. That's how you do a transition. Having covered writing at the step level, let's take this down to the paragraph level, a little bit more granular. So again, you want to keep things short. How short is short? Looking again at our Nginx tutorial, notice that each of these paragraphs consists of a single sentence. Now, if you have some just-in-time information to impart, then you'll put that background in the paragraph where it's relevant. But in this part of the tutorial, you're just doing one thing. We're telling the reader to run a command. We provide the command, one sentence to confirm. And then we tell them again, now you have access. Then run this command. And we tell them what that does. You'll note that we never tell the reader to run a command or run code without telling them what it does. There's too many possibilities of things going wrong there, or even malicious code. So everything that we do, every description of what the reader is doing can be defined in a single sentence. If it gets more complicated, then you add another sentence to explain. Experienced users may be noting here that you could have done these 2 commands in a single command. And that makes sense for an experienced user, but we're not assuming an experienced user. We want them to understand each piece, each part of the process in isolation. So to do that, we break down the commands into their simplest components. Maybe after doing this a dozen times, then the reader's going to be able to combine the commands, but right now, we don't want to assume that. So relevance. When you're talking about a paragraph within a step, just as each step has to be part of the overall tutorial goal, each paragraph should relate to the step goal. If you find yourself wandering off topic, possibly because of some just-in-time learning, have a look at that. Length of paragraphs will be a nice indicator that you're starting to wander away from your point. So this is something that you do after you've written a draft. You go back and you look at it and look at each paragraph individually and say, is this helpful to the step? Is this required part of the step? Or is it background? Is it part of a different step? Does it need to be here? Related to that, watch out for subheadings. This is an outline for a fictional Apache tutorial, but so it consists of 2 steps, installing Apache and configuring Apache. That makes sense. Both of these things have the same weight. You install and then you configure. The problem here is that installing Apache takes basically 1 command. I mean, there'll be some more information and context around it, but the user doesn't have to do a lot more than install Apache with a command. Now, the configuring step, however, has multiple sub-steps as part of it. Adjusting the firewall, checking the server, etc., etc. So what you're going to end up with here is a step 1 that's extremely short and a step 2 that consumes the rest of the tutorial. So to fix that, you can promote all of the subheadings to the top level. Now, maybe it's not as parallel as it used to be, but you've provided readers with different chunks that they can work with signposts in between, which is more important than strict parallelism. Let's take this down a little bit further, writing at the sentence level. So again, you want to look for the verb. The examples in this section, incidentally, are made up to illustrate the point. I'm not picking on anyone specifically. A sentence like the firewall settings are the next thing you need to change, so open the config file to do that. The verb you're looking for in this context is open. So if we move the verb to the front of the sentence, then it becomes more powerful. Open the config file to change the firewall settings. So note that not only have we strengthened the sentence by moving the verb to the front, we've also made it shorter, which will help with cognitive processing. Use the active voice. Again, flashback to fourth grade English. The new user command is used to create a new user. So the difference between active and passive voice is in an active voice situation, the entity or the person that's doing the action is also the subject of the verb. In this case, the sentence doesn't actually have the actor appearing anywhere. The new user command, that's the subject of the sentence. Then the verb is used. We don't know who's using it. We just know that it's being done. And in fact, we're not actually telling the reader to do anything in this sentence. We're just telling them a fact. So is used to create, that's the whole verb here. Whereas if we phrase it as create a new user with the new user command, we've conveyed the same information, but we've turned it into an imperative sentence in active voice. You, the user, is the subject. Create a new user. That's the verb. So a tip for identifying active versus passive voice, if you find yourself using is, are, was, were, they're called auxiliary verbs or linking verbs, to create a multi-part verb, not always, but usually an indicator that you've got some passive voice somewhere. Keep things short. I did say this was going to be a theme. This sentence here is perfectly grammatically correct. It's just long. Configure the firewall. There you go. Verbs right at the beginning. By opening the config file, navigating to the section, adding the ports, and saving the file. The problem here is that we've got multiple verbs in one extra long sentence. So the solution is to break them up. Configure the firewall by opening the config file, period. Navigate to the allowed port section, period. Add the ports, period, then save the file. We've made this into 4 sentences, and in fact, if I weren't operating on a slide, I would probably make these individual paragraphs with code examples or commands in between. So a period at the end of a sentence can be one of those cognitive rest stops for the reader. Okay, having talked about steps and paragraphs and sentences, I am going to break this down to individual words, or specifically writing tone, because these are some traps that people tend to fall into just based on what you learned, what you've seen before, and force of habit. So the most important thing when writing a tutorial tone is to be confident casual. Almost everybody's seen or heard an instructor or someone speaking like this. It is important to remember that security is critical to the functioning, and you can hear that rhythm going. It's a lecture hall type rhythm that's almost guaranteed to put your reader to sleep. The problem here is that the writer isn't convinced of their own authority. They want to emphasize to the reader that what they're saying is important, so they flat out tell them this is important. They've undercut their own message by using too many words and continually telling people that something's important. If you are the author of a particular tutorial, then you are automatically invested with a level of authority. It's in the word. So what you want to do to achieve confident casual is imagine that you're speaking one-on-one with your audience. The mistake that people make when they're writing is that they assume that I am the one writer and there's 1,000 readers out there who are going to be reading it. And while that's true, that's not the experience the reader has. The reader is experiencing it one-to-one. They're the reader, the only one present, and there's one author. So if you imagine that you are speaking to somebody one-to-one, you're going to lose that lecture hall tone. The person that you're speaking to, I say envision them as a junior colleague. They're bright, they're interested, they're motivated to learn. They have the information that they need to get this far, but there's a specific task they're trying to do. They don't know how, and they've asked you for help. So, removing all of the extra verbiage from our example sentence, configure your firewall to open only the ports you need to. We've said the same thing and reduced the sentence by about 2/3. So along with the confident casual, if you are thinking of addressing a junior colleague, address the reader in second person. It's very common to use the word we. It's not exactly the royal we. It's usually called the editorial we. It implies that I, the author, and you, the readers, are doing something together. That's a nice sentiment, but it's not true in practicality. You, the reader, are writing it, or you, the author, are writing it at some point, and the reader is going to be reading it much later, possibly days, possibly years. So at that point, you, the author, aren't present. So there's no we involved. It's just you. It's just the reader. So a sentence like this, next we'll create a dedicated user. Okay, that's fairly standard, but we aren't going to be doing it. Change the we to you. Next, you'll create a dedicated user. That's the exact same meaning, and it puts the emphasis on the reader, which again strengthens the sentence and brings out the verb. Use your audience's vocabulary within being confident casual. An overcorrection that people do is to simplify things down to the point where you're not trusting the reader to have the vocabulary that you need. So if you look at this sentence, you'll create a modal that appears with a no JavaScript approach using blah, blah, blah pseudo class, blah, blah, blah properties. If you're looking at this in isolation on a slide, it looks pretty dense. If I told you that this sentence is taken from the middle of a tutorial about CSS, that in itself is halfway through a 20 article series of CSS tutorials, then things start to make more sense. When the reader gets to this point, they'll know what a modal is, they'll know what a pseudo class is, they'll know what properties are. This will make perfect sense in that context. And you'll notice that the author has used you and he's moved the verb near the front. This is entirely appropriate for that particular audience. A big one, avoid the words easy and simple. The goal here, the motivation, is to reassure the reader that this is something that they can do, that it isn't all that difficult if you follow the instructions. But the bottom line is, a lot of these things are difficult. It's achievable if you follow the instructions, but there may be any number of reasons why a reader may fail to accomplish the task in a tutorial. There might be some configuration that they didn't account for. There might be things have changed since the tutorial was written. They might just be having a bad day and aren't bringing their full attention to it. And if that's the case, not only have they failed at the task, but because we told them it was simple, now they feel stupid. So to avoid that, we simply speak to them directly. We avoid words like simple and easy, and even words like just. So configuring a new container in Kubernetes isn't as hard as it sounds. You simply add the proper YAML to the kube control file. So highlight this isn't as hard as it sounds. That's similar to easy and simply. If you take those things out of the sentence, the information is the same. To configure a new container in Kubernetes, you add the proper YAML to the kube control file. Nothing about this sentence has changed, except it's less patronizing. We tell the reader to do it, we assume that they will succeed, and we write based on that assumption. By the same token, in a conclusion, you don't use the word congratulations or yay, you did it. If the tutorial is being followed, you assume that they were going to be able to do it. Finally, beware of marketing copy. It's very common when you're starting out a tutorial to think, I need to tell the reader what this is. I need to tell the reader why they're going to want to use it. Except you don't actually have to tell them that, because if they're reading this tutorial, they want to know how to do something with your product. They don't need to be sold the product. They've already decided to use it. But it's also extremely common just to want to make your product sound better. So you might end up with a sentence like, foobar is a powerful new JavaScript framework that allows you to load complex UIs at lightning speed. Now, lightning speed can't be verified. We can't measure that. So in order to stick to the facts and be objective and avoid marketing copy, look at the claims. So if you say instead, foobar is a JavaScript framework, okay, that's verifiable. And that allows you to load complex UIs more quickly. More quickly than what? More quickly than you could without it. You can verify that. You can take measurements to see how fast the UI loads. I do want to note the word complex here, because what is a complex UI? So that's a subjective judgment, yes, but I would wager that if shown two different UIs, you could probably tell me which one is more complex. It's not necessarily measurable. This is definitely a border case, but sometimes writing's like that. It's not as well defined as code. So I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts, and they have verbs in them. So look for the verbs, focus on what the users want to do, and move the verbs up front to make them more powerful. Thanks for coming along with me for this talk. My contact information, and there's where you can find the slides.